Okay, well, today we have another interview of EFSAS, and this time not online. We have Peymana Assad with us here in Amsterdam at our office. Peymana, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, Peymana. You are, I'll give you a short introduction of yours. You are the representative of Roxeth South Harrow on the London Borough of Harrow Council.
Yes.
But you're also the first person of Afghan-origin, and I guess also the first Afghan-origin female then, elected to public office in the UK.
Yes. Yes, I am.
That is quite a feat, I guess, from where, women in Afghanistan or girls in Afghanistan, the hardships they are facing now. Can you, just before we get into Afghanistan and all the other issues in the region, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? When did you leave Afghanistan? How? I know that 2 years ago you were on the you were evacuated from Afghanistan when it fell to the Taliban, but you left Afghanistan somewhere in the 90s. Can you describe us what Afghanistan was then and how you left and what happened to you in the UK? Why you chose public office? What are the reasons?
I mean, it's a long story, but my family left in the early 90s when I was about 3 going on 4. And the reason they left is because of the internal civil war that was happening at that time. So the fall of the Najib government and the internal battles between the different Mujahideen groups. And my parents saw that there was no future for specifically me and my sister in Afghanistan. But there's a whole long story in terms of what happened. My father was working for an NGO, the World Food Programme, and also Mercy Corps International, an American aid agency. And he was actually supporting IDPs, internally displaced people in Afghanistan from the civil war from Kabul. We were staying at that time in Jalalabad, which is in the east of Afghanistan, and my father was giving out contraceptive pills in the IDP camps to try and control the birth rate, because it was very difficult to feed the amount of children that were in the IDP camp. And obviously there was extremist elements at the time who didn't agree with this kind of thing, so my father disappeared. And my mother said that this situation is unsustainable for the future, because there was always threats on our family's lives, and she decided that she would take the political asylum that was given by the UN and leave. And so she left and we came to the UK, and she had remembered that there was this place in London that she wanted to live in because she'd heard about it from friends in Afghanistan. And she'd remembered it by the Afghan name Haroon. So when she turned up at London Heathrow, the immigration officers asked her where she wanted to live, and she said, I want to live in a place called Haroon. And they said, where is that? And she said, somewhere in London. And they said, oh, Harrow. And so that's where my family ended up. That's where I grew up. That's where I went to school. And I ended up going to university just down the road in Oxford, in Brunel University. And I studied international relations. And just before then, actually, I went to Afghanistan for the first time in 2007 after we had left. So I don't really remember much of the Afghanistan in the 90s, but what I do remember is small things, running around the IDP camp, chasing after a dog. They're just really small memories. But in 2007 was when I went first time, sort of as a teenager. I went for my uncle's wedding, and I think that trip basically changed my perspective on the trajectory and plan, because originally I wanted to go and study medicine, like most Asian kids do, and also that's what my parents are pushing me towards. But actually I quickly realised that's not where my passions lie, and actually it was more about public service and more about giving back. And so I thought maybe once I graduate I will come back to Afghanistan and work. But once I got my master's in conflict security and development and I decided to return to Afghanistan, my parents were completely against the idea, because at that time it was a huge Taliban resurgence, and there was lots of conversations that there was a new peace process happening that President Karzai had started during that time. And so my family felt it was not the right time for me to return. And so I did what most new adult teenager kind of does, lays around for 6 months, refused to find a job. And then my dad said, why don't you try and volunteering in your local community? And I said, well, who's there to help in the UK? it's a developed country. I'm sure there's no one suffering and struggling here. And he said you'd be surprised. So I ended up working for this charity that was helping single mums. And there was this one lady who came in. She was pregnant. She had 2 kids under 5. She couldn't speak a word of the language, but she was Afghan. And I was trying to help her from not becoming homeless. And I think that situation infuriated me to a point where I was like, well, clearly there's a gap here in British politics, and you need to be at the decision-making table to try and push policies forward. And so that's how I got into the Labour Party. That's how I stood for office. And then in 2018, I became a councillor. And I guess by accident in a way, because that wasn't originally the plan, but it happened that way. And I didn't realise at the time that there was no one else. But yeah, so that's how I became the first.
But people have this perception, and especially in the West, but also in our region, that women are, first of all, they're not allowed to do much outside of the household, but especially public office, public life. So how was your family? How did they view this? Were they supportive of it, or?
So, when I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to have a Facebook account. My parents were like completely against this idea of me having photos online and having a Facebook account, because there's a lot of talk in the community. Once I posted a Facebook photo where my parents didn't know I had a Facebook account, and someone saw it online and then told someone else in the community, who told my grandmother, who then ended up telling my mum. And my mum was like, why do you have this photo? Now everyone is talking about it. And I was like, it's just a normal photo. So I came from like a very protective sort of family.
Would you say conservative?
I would say moderate. I wouldn't say conservative, and I wouldn't say liberal to a point to other people. My family is very moderate. Like, we're practicing Muslims, but we're also very moderate in terms of clothing and also freedoms for women. So my family were quite very relaxed in that sense. So when I started volunteering with the Labour Party, I think initially my parents didn't take it seriously. They thought that, this is just a phase. She will go through it and then she will get over it. And my parents were actually trying to push me to become a teacher, but I thought that was the worst profession that you could possibly do. For me anyways, I thought that I didn't want to be a teacher. And, I completely respect the teaching profession, but I just didn't want to be a teacher. And I guess that's for them. They were thinking more of the Afghan term context, and Afghanistan teachers are respected and all this kind of
Doctor,
stuff.
teacher, engineer,
Lawyer, exactly. Yeah, and I just didn't want to do any of those. I wanted to go out of that and do more of the NGO and public sector sort of stuff. And when you look at that sector, you think of more rich middle class type communities rather than working class communities. My family I grew up in a council estate in London, in a very deprived working class community. So it's not like I grew up in like a middle class neighbourhood or area, but an area that's much better than others. So I think my family were initially like, oh, she'll get over this. But when they saw that I was actually really serious, and I think they really took me seriously when I got elected, on the night that I actually got elected, they were like, okay, then she's really serious about this. And then they saw how much effort and work that I do within the community, and they're hugely supportive of the work that I do, and encourage me actually to dream bigger and to aim higher.
And while you have, of course, you left Afghanistan when you were very young, 3 to 4 years old, and then you went back for a while. So you've spent most of your lifetime in the UK, but still Afghanistan is of course a red thread within your life. You're still in your politics as well, are very much still concentrated on things happening in Afghanistan and to the Afghan community in the UK. So why
does that come from?
Yeah, because at some point of time you're a councillor and you need to just be focused on things happening in the UK, but you still have that connection.
I think that one part of it is that when I was at university, I was consistently going to Afghanistan every year, doing sort of volunteering, humanitarian aid work, fundraising, but also volunteering when I was out there. And I was building these networks and knowing and finding out more information and just awareness and education about what's going on the ground. And then when I did my master's, I was able to sort of, and also my undergraduate degree, familiarize myself sort of in an academic way. So both my dissertations, both my undergrad and my master's dissertations were on Afghanistan. So I wrote my undergrad thesis on the Durand Line, and my master's degree thesis was on Pakistan's role in Afghanistan. So both times was very focused on the region and Afghanistan itself. And then after that, in terms of continuing to go back, even though I was elected and I was working in the NGO sector, sitting on boards for British charities who were working in Afghanistan and helping them understand how to work within that context. So if it was from building schools in remote provinces, or doing emergency winter aid or emergency packages for widows and various other impacted communities in Afghanistan, that's where the connection originally came from more of a volunteering aspect, and then it turned to more of a political nature in terms of when I got elected in 2018. The ambassador, the British ambassador, former British ambassador now in Kabul, hosted a reception for me when I got elected because I was the first. And so I was able to meet young women who were working within various sectors in Afghanistan in a more formalized political kind of nature and way at the embassy to understand more of their work and what they're doing. I also met with the peace marchers in Afghanistan and just various different groups over that period and that time. I also got to sit down with, well, over the years, the former Taliban foreign minister, Mullah Mutawakkil, which I got a lot of backlash for online, because I feel and I think that it's important that if you go out there, that you need to engage all different types of group to get sort of a fuller picture. So, from Amrullah Saleh to Mullah Mutawakkil to these peace activists to young women, this gives you a whole different type of understanding of the country. And over time, that's helped keep my connections with people on the ground and to give me a better understanding in terms of what's going on.
And when you talk about understanding, how do you bridge the gap, which is there, the lack of understanding there is in Afghanistan for the West and also the UK, and the lack of understanding there is in the UK for Afghanistan? How do you bridge that?
Well, it's really difficult to bridge it, but I think the thing that we need to do is to try and make people on both sides understand that there's a lot of similarities and common issues, but there's also this different context in terms of what goes on in the UK and what goes on in Afghanistan, and how we bridge that. For Afghanistan, it's mainly focused on peace and stability within the country, but also on an understanding of how the war impacts families in Afghanistan and how the West, especially the UK, influences those kinds of policies and decisions. And in the UK, we need to understand how our voting in Parliament and how our policies on foreign and international policies impact countries like Afghanistan. And the bridge, how you build the bridge, is through awareness, is through education, is through understanding the culture and the society better, and that is by informing yourself and not just making preconceived conceptions on these issues.
So how did you feel when you were in, was it Kabul? So how did you feel when you took one of those last civil evacuation flights, when you saw reasonable, stable Afghanistan for, the 2 decades before that, fall to the Taliban? What was your feeling as an Afghan? And as a Brit councillor, politician in Britain, because I think there is some introspection over there. At the same time, you're also an Afghan, so you do see your country falling.
I think that it was really hard. It was emotionally really difficult. Me and my father had to go around the house and take down the Afghan flag, the tricolour Afghan flag, take down musical instruments and all this stuff in case it put anybody in danger who was still in the house, and get rid of those things. That was really difficult, and watching the sheer panic and the chaos in Kabul when the Taliban came in during that time, that was that was very hard. I think I was in shock for most of it. I didn't believe that this was happening. There was one moment actually when I had failed to get into the Borough Hotel, which was the evacuation point for British citizens, and I was told by the security group that I was in to find somewhere inside to get inside, because the Taliban had just approached the road to the airport, and so we were just 20 minutes this way to the Borough. And I went into this house. There's the first house there was a road, and I knocked on the first door on the house, and they let me in. They were very worried. What is this person doing out on the street? So they let me in, and I remember there was this young girl who'd just come home from school. She was in the typical Afghan school clothes, this black dress, white scarf. And I said to her in Dari, the Taliban are back. Like, how do you feel? And she said to me, that's a joke. You're joking. And I said to her, no, like, really, they're back. Like, how do you, like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? Did you just come back from school? And she said, yeah, I think people are joking. This is such a joke. Like, everyone's just pretending. And she was about 7 or 8. And I said to her, okay, come with me. And we were at the window. And from the window, you could see the Taliban flag that had just gone up across the other side. So I pointed to the Taliban flag and I said to her, but look, there's a Taliban. She goes, someone's playing a bad joke. That's a real joke. And I didn't want to break this young girl's heart even more. So I just said to her, yeah, it must be a really bad joke. And she said, okay, I'm going to bring some food now. And then she went and brought me food and we sat down together and had food. But that conversation, I think, summarizes everything that was going on at that moment in time, where people just genuinely didn't believe that it was real because of the 20 years of progress. You know, it was like on the Saturday, I was in a restaurant where I was sitting with a friend and we were just normally like sitting there and talking, and then a table next to us was this group of young Afghan women who just come from the Ministry of Finance down the road and were having lunch on their lunch break. And I was looking at them and I was thinking to myself, wow, like Afghanistan has progressed so much that a group of young women who work in a ministry can come and have lunch together, and they're talking about, you know, the normal things that everyday life has to offer. And by the next day, everything was sort of turned over and the Taliban were back.
Have you ever spoken again to that young girl?
No, but what I do know is that she ended up leaving with her family 6 months after and being taken to the US because of the proximity to the Borough Hotel and the families that they had helped during that time.
So she was one of the lucky few.
Lucky few, yeah.
To come back to the Taliban, and you were describing these women who were there on their lunch break. You know, as far as I've, read, I'm not a religious scholar, but as far as I've read religion, there are of course a lot of things in religion. What is this obsession of the Taliban with women? Why is it so much concentrated on oppression of women? There's a lot of other things in Islam as well, which are, for the time very progressive, very peaceful. Why is it always about the women?
I don't know, you tell me. We need to ask the Taliban that. But I genuinely do think it's about control. The thing that they can control is the women. The thing that they can try and beat down on, kill, abuse, that is the more vulnerable part of society. And it has been Afghan women and girls who've been mostly at the forefront. But that's not to forget that Afghan men and boys are also under attack by the Taliban in Afghanistan at the moment as well. And I think that we need to remember that because women are indirectly also under attack through the pressure that the Taliban put on the male members of families. But I do think it's about control. The Taliban want to control that section of society. But I think that if we look at it from sort of a political perspective, you control women, you can control your next generation of fighters. So if you do not have educated women, you do not have an active 50% female population in your country, you can control so much that goes on within the economy, within social circles, and culturally too. you don't have an educated woman in the home, that means that you can get their son to become one of your ideological bearers of your ideology. And I genuinely think that that is what the Taliban perspective is on. If you have an uneducated female population in Afghanistan, there's more chance that the sons that come out those homes, that are born into those homes, become supporters of the Taliban.
And you know, you just described the fact that you have done a thesis on the Duran line, and you have done a thesis on the role of Pakistan, or the Pakistani military, as it were, in Afghanistan and the Taliban.
Yes.
When you talk about these young boys who join the Taliban, or become these, you know, in the 80s we used to call them mujahideens, and now terrorist radicals. How much are these young boys to be blamed for it, who are often 14, 15, 16, and how much is the system or the mindset to be blamed for it?
I think the first thing that needs to be blamed is war and conflict, because war and conflict brings poverty, and poverty then brings situations where people are forced to either send their children to madrasas because of the meals and the stability that it provides children, and those madrasas then institutionalize and brainwash young boys into thinking certain ways. The Taliban mindset, the extremist ideology, and pushing that out. So I think war and conflict and poverty is to blame for these kinds of situations. Because if you have 40 years of war, then you have not one generation, not two, but you have 3 generations who've been, or 4 generations who've been impacted by war, who then go into a cycle of poverty, who then rely on places like religious institutions like the mosque and the madrasa to try and provide something for their children. So I think that's the first thing. And the second is that on these young boys themselves, I think that, you know, most people say that a good Talib is a dead Talib. That's the general consensus. But I've always disagreed with that, because most of these families, if you actually speak to them, many of them, I have actually spoken to the wives of the Taliban and sat down with some of them who actually have been recruited into Taliban ideology. They don't understand what they're fighting for. They think that they're fighting for this religious concept of going to heaven and then being given however many virgins at the end of it, or whatever else. Some of these individuals, some of these young people, cannot even read and write. You know, Afghan languages. They can't even read the Quran Sharif themselves. They just memorize or are told what to believe by mullahs. And some of them, at extreme cases, don't even know how to do the ablution for prayer. And so this is the type of ideology that we're dealing with, brainwashing basically, to a point where you're just using a human being as cannon fodder.
Who is using?
The Taliban, extremist groups, as cannon fodder for their political objectives. So I think the only people that we can blame really are the extremists who are doing this.
You talked about the role of the Pakistani military establishment. What about it?
The Pakistani military establishment, I mean, what do you want me to say? There's so much to say on this.
Yeah, you just blame the extremists, and then of course the extremists are also like
supported by somebody.
Again, because extremists in itself don't have a political objective. A political objective is mainly done by states or political groups. On the other hand, I don't know whether it's still the case, but I do know that in the 80s, during the after the 80s Soviet-Afghan War, a lot of people who used to, Peshawar in Pakistan was the largest population from Afghanistan refugees who came there, and many of them were actually, instead of being given asylum, actually trained in madrasas there and then sent back to fight. So this role, when you talk about 40 years of war, this role goes back to the era that many of these mujahideens were fighting the West, the war of the West against the Soviet Union. So this role is very, very old. There have been books written about it. So and you have been very critical about that role. So how much culpability is there? Everyone has been culpable in this conflict.
Yeah.
I agree. The Afghans have been, the West has been. So how would you rate these culpabilities?
So I think obviously when if we're looking at who to blame, well, the Soviet Union's the first, Russia, because they invaded and they created this instability in the first place. But then after that, it comes the West, the Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, and in this moment in time, it would be those regional countries surrounding Afghanistan. And one of them is mainly Pakistan, because most of the Afghans who left went into Pakistan. It hosts one of the largest Afghan refugee populations in the world. And I think that what Pakistan has successfully done for its national objectives and national interests is use Afghan refugees not only to get money and funding from the United Nations and from other Western countries, but also use it in its strategic objective with the strategic depth policy within Afghanistan. But I think that that's now has sort of a backlash on itself, because if we currently see what's going on in Pakistan, the instability, I think it's had a reverse effect than what Pakistani government or the military had hoped that it would have. I honestly do not understand this paranoia and this difficulty that Pakistan has had with Afghanistan. But from everyone that I've spoken to, all the academics, all the researchers, all on the Pakistani side, it comes back to Afghanistan vetoing Pakistan's entrance into the United Nations and it being recognized as a formal state. And that links back to the Durand Line and that disputed border. For me, the Pakistani military's culpability in this conflict is at the top, because what it's done is it's supported the Taliban to do what it's doing now in Afghanistan. There would be no Taliban return without the Pakistani ISI support. So I think they are number one culprit in this conflict.
Is that why the previous ISI chief was having this celebratory coffee or tea in Kabul when it just fell?
Yeah, I think you didn't see any other intelligence chief roaming Kabul and having a cup of tea in the Serena Hotel. It was the Pakistani ISI chief who was doing that. Every time you see someone talk about Afghanistan on international global stage, it is the Pakistani foreign minister or Pakistani politicians or Pakistani ministers speaking on behalf of Afghans and Afghanistan. And I think that's probably the most infuriating thing for Afghans, because they support something in another country that they wouldn't support for themselves. And I think that's hypocritical on a hugely personal, social, and political level that we probably don't have time to unpack. But I think that what the ISI has achieved, they think that they probably achieved the strategic depth that they've always wanted to. And strategic depth means having a weak Kabul administration or pro-Pakistani Kabul administration in order to have a secure border on this side, so that if there was a war with India, they'd be able to fight India. But I think that Pakistan needs to come to the realization that actually India's kind of moved on. India's kind of doing some other stuff entirely globally in the region. It's kind of moved on from this India-Pakistan conflict, in my perspective, from what I've seen, and that it really needs to focus on itself. But I think this influence on the Taliban and promoting the Taliban in Afghanistan has backfired.
But there is a perception currently that things are not so cozy between the Taliban and the Pakistanis. So you might blame them for whatever happened in the past and for putting the Taliban into power of today. But many Pakistanis themselves and even Western observers are saying that things are not that hunky-dory anymore between the ISI and the Taliban. Is that?
But they've been saying this for a long, long time, you know, before the ISI and the Pakistanis were saying that we can't bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. We can't get them to agree peace. But then we saw 2020, the Doha agreement happen, and the US acknowledged Pakistan's role in that agreement. So we know that these things are possible. We know that they can happen. And I think that this is a wholly PR exercise. And the reason why it's there is because Pakistan wants to wait and remove itself in terms of being identified as being close to the Taliban in any shape or form in globally, and keep that sort of undercover because of their own political objectives globally and regionally.
And maybe because they were globally under a lot of scrutiny in the past few years by the IMF and by the FATF.
Yeah, I mean, economically they're under huge pressure, but I also think about what Imran Khan did in terms of visiting Putin and having that visit to Russia. I think that didn't also help. But I also think that because of what the Taliban are doing currently to women and girls in the country, and also killing and disappearing anybody who politically disagrees with the Taliban, most of those tactics are directly from the ISI. If you look and compare what the ISI is doing in Afghanistan now to what the ISI does in Balochistan, to what the ISI does in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it's so very similar. Very similar tactics in terms of imprisoning political activists like Matiullah Wisa, who is currently in Taliban prison, has been in Taliban prison for 2 months, an educational activist. Pakistan does the same thing to their activists in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and in Balochistan. And when you see former Afghan government officials who worked in the Afghan and defense and security forces being shot and killed, you know, these types of tactics are what the Taliban has been picked up or being taught by their supporters next door.
You just talked about Pakistan and its strategic depth, and of course its enmity it has with India. You also said that India has moved on. I would maybe say that India, you know, India's the bigger enmity in the region is India and China.
Yeah.
And actually is India and Pakistan, at least for now. Many people don't know that India's nuclear program was actually in response to China's nuclear program, and you know, So, but and there's another big giant there, which we just talked about, and that's China. Recently, in the past, you know, few decades, China has been coming closer to Pakistan, and not known for its own very, you know, democratic credentials, if you may say so. So, how much of influence does China have in Pakistan, and then subsequently, of course, in Afghanistan?
So I think that obviously the Pakistan and China relationship impacts how India responds to a lot of what's happening in the region. But we also must not forget that what China does in Afghanistan in terms of minerals, mines, contracts with the Taliban they've recently brought up, that's part of their economic strategy. So I think China's more get in there economically to then influence the policies of that country, which they've also done in Pakistan. If you see the economic, in Sri Lanka, in some parts of the African continent that China's been in. So I think that China's role is the economic influence, which is also probably why Pakistan is currently struggling with the IMF and various other issues. But I think that in terms of the Taliban relationship with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China, I think China's influence doesn't really care about the politics in terms of human rights violations. No, democracy, who care their internal interests, and that is very much economic dominance.
Could it also have to do with something, in that region you of course have a huge Uyghur population,
yes,
which China is not very happy with,
no.
And of course the Taliban claims to be protectors of Muslims, not to have the Taliban suddenly look towards the Uyghurs as well, because let's be honest, the Taliban and Mujahideen in Afghanistan have many times spoken about the Muslims in Palestine, the Muslims in Kashmir, the Muslims in India, the Muslims in various places, but I don't hear them much about the Uyghurs. So do you think that political aspect could have to do with it?
Yes, I think so. There were some reports that actually the Taliban had done some kind of deals with the Chinese.
The oil deal.
But in terms of actually returning Uyghur refugees who had actually come into Afghanistan back to China, based on some of the mineral, the mine contracts that the Chinese had signed with the Taliban. But in terms of what Pakistan influences on Afghanistan, I think the Kashmir, speaking on Palestine, speaking on the Muslims in India, that is a very much Pakistani influence. And the reason why I say that is because of the social influence, not because of anything else. If you look at the Taliban, ministers and those in the government at the moment, the majority of them lived their entire lives in Pakistan, right? So they've been educated, gone to school, they have homes there, their children go to school there still. That naturally, generally impacts a person. So if you grew up in a country, I'm British, there are a lot of things that impact me, that are very British that someone else would not understand. And so naturally, an Afghan growing up in Pakistan would pick up some of those mannerisms, those cultural contexts. So that's where I think that culturally and socially that the influence comes from there. But I don't see the Taliban speaking on the Uyghur situation because they have interests with getting the Chinese to sign investment contracts in Afghanistan economically, because no other country currently wants to invest in a regime that's putting measures across that are impacting 50% of its population.
Okay, then my last question on this terrorist conundrum and the role of Pakistan, of course, is one of the things which is not mentioned very often anymore. I personally also feel that Afghanistan has been off the radar for quite some time because of Ukraine and Russia, probably. But one of the most elusive things in Afghanistan with terrorist groups in the region, which has a huge influence, is of course the Haqqani network. So how much of a role, you just said the ISI controls the Taliban, but then the ISI also controls the Haqqani network. And then the Haqqani network is part of the government of the Taliban. So how do you explain this?
How do I explain that the ISI has influence over the Haqqani network? Well, they got their training and their support and their funding from within
And
Pakistan.
Why is it to undermine the Taliban, or is it to...
I think that the Pakistanis, or the ISI, let's say, understand that sometimes you will fall out with individuals and you need to have another group. And they've also, if you read some of the books that the former Pakistani ISI generals have written, they say the more hardcore extremists are the better fighters. That's why they funded Hikmatyar so much during the Mujahideen fighting against the Soviet Union. So I think that it's natural for them to go towards more religious extremist elements or terrorist elements within the Taliban. But the Haqqani network are recognized as a terrorist organization. And I think that this is a huge gap and grey area where the West is not really talking about and really trying to understand why is it that Pakistan, a country that negotiates and gets Western funding, continues to support a UN-recognized terrorist group. It's a huge black hole and issue that people just don't want to touch and don't want to talk about. But I think that for them, it's their strategic aims to have splinter groups within the Taliban, so that if one group gets out of line, they can bring in another one, or they can use the more religious extremist element to further their aims. But I also think something that we haven't talked about is the religious extremist elements within the ISI, who all have sympathetic, ideological thinking in line with the Taliban, in line with the Haqqani network. And that in itself is a threat to the democratic structure that we see in Pakistan at the moment. I think a lot of people don't talk about this, but I think that naturally there is. And that's because of decades of support and engagement with the Taliban.
So you think there's a part of it which does it for strategic depth, but a big chunk of it is actually ideologically aligned?
I think there is an ideologically aligned element within the ISI who is sympathetic to the jihadi extremist ideology. Yes.
Within Afghanistan, but also within their own country.
Within their own country, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there have been reports about this, but I didn't know that, it's like so big that...
No, I genuinely do believe that there is, because of it doesn't make sense otherwise. But I also think that in the 4 decades of war that we've seen in Afghanistan, the change within the ISI itself and the more extreme support that it's given to organizations like the Haqqani Network, that there can only be one reason for that. And if there's been a backlash in Pakistan at the moment from the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, what other objective is there? All this anti-West rhetoric that we see in Pakistan, the military can only allow something like that to happen.
And eventually, well, some might disagree, but I believe that the military eventually will win this war as well.
Well, yeah, we have to see.
Okay.
We have to see, I guess, because we don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to understand what's currently going on in Pakistan because of the way Imran Khan is using the situation of his arrest and his, the corruption charges against him and all this other stuff. But I think this isn't very uncommon in Pakistan political history. We've seen this so many times before. So this is again another moment in history where we will see what happens, I guess, and how that impacts what happens in Afghanistan. But from the current moment, what we see is that there is no change in Afghanistan, and there will only be change when the West is really serious about engaging in that region.
You also talked about the Durand Line.
Yeah.
There are many Afghans, or I guess I've not met any Afghan who has basically said that we agree with this line. What is this line? Why do the Afghans and the Pashtuns living on the other side? Why is this? Because we hear a lot about these, borders. We hear a lot about the line of actual control, which is the de facto border between India and China. But there you also have skirmishes between both countries. We of course hear a lot about the LOC, the line of control between Indian-administered and Pakistan-administered Jammu and Kashmir. These are quite well known in the press and in public discourse. The Durand Line isn't.
It's not known. No, it's very true. The Durand Line is not known that much because it's considered an internationally recognized border, and so nobody thinks that there is a border dispute between Afghanistan and Pakistan on this. So originally, when India was partitioned into 2 different countries in Pakistan and India, half of what was Afghanistan was taken, and half of what was India was taken, and a bit of the Kashmir region to make Pakistan as it is today. Prior to that, the Afghan government wrote a letter to the British East India Company requesting that the Durand Line be renegotiated and the land returned to Afghanistan. So the land is up until the Indus. Afghanistan claims it all the way up until the Indus, but the line was drawn to where the Durand Line is now, which is the internationally recognized border. Without going into too much of the history, but there were wars fought between Afghanistan and the British at the time because Britain wanted control of Afghanistan as another colony or a colonial empire because of the influence of Russia. And they ended up to this agreement. We won't go into the history of how this agreement came about.
The Great Game,
which happened at that time. Yes. But Mortimer Durand initially was basically the person who went to Amir Abdul Rahman and signed this Durand Line agreement at the time. The Amir gave Waziristan, which is now known as Waziristan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, those areas, saying that they're unruly and difficult to deal with, so let the British deal with them for a while, but we will get them back one day. Many Afghans say that the agreement was only set for 100 years and that the 100 years expired in the 1990s, and so that land should have been returned. But the reason why it's not spoken about that much is because the UN recognizes it as an international border. Afghanistan put in a complaint to the UN at the time saying we've asked for this back, but we didn't get a response from the British. The British initially basically said when they left the region, not our problem anymore, go and talk to Pakistan about it. But there are some legal issues here in terms of who was actually the successor state. The successor state to the British leaving is India, because that is the country that was left. But because it's split into two different countries, there is some difficulty on who you actually negotiate about the line. And so that's when Afghanistan actually vetoed Pakistan's entrance into the United Nations based on this border dispute and saying that we have not negotiated this border and therefore Afghanistan rejects the entry of Pakistan into the United Nations.
And this is also one of the reasons that
Pakistan
has had
hostility,
a big role and hostility in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
There's one thing about the Durand Line, and that I find, in our region, it's quite difficult to get people to agree on anything.
Yeah.
But successive governments, whether it's monarchies, whether it's democratically elected governments during the last 2 decades, or the Taliban, no Afghan government has ever recognized the Durand Line.
Yes. And I think that's because it has a sentimental issue. And the reason is because you've divided basically the Pashtun ethnic group. The majority of people who were divided were Pashtuns on this end. Those, if you look at some of the villages, you have aunts and uncles living on one side of the village and aunts and uncles living on. So you're basically putting a border between an entire village,
which in essence happened during partition,
and it's happened all over the world. But there it's basically split families. So you have aunts and uncles living on this side, and aunts and uncles living on this, or brothers and sisters, or mums and dads, or whatever it is. And so that's the difficult part, because you basically the majority ethnic group. Many people say that's a controversial statement as well. But if we look at this from the statistics that were previously, the Pashtuns are considered to be the majority ethnic group, and that is the ethnic group that's being divided by the line. As well as obviously the Baloch at the bottom, because people don't realise actually you have quite a bit of a Baloch population in Helmand, and also in Kandahar, and in those areas. And the Kurchis and the nomads, their life became very difficult because of this line, because they actually used to go between these places and take their animals to graze in these places. At that time, they were given cards, sort of to be able to roam freely, and then afterwards it became a fence, and the fence kept moving inwards towards Afghanistan because of successive wars and difficulties. So that is the primary reason why no Afghan government has recognized it. But also, I think strategically and politically, it makes Afghanistan a landlocked country. Without that piece of land, Afghanistan could have had access to the sea, and had a seaport and access to different types of trading opportunities and economic opportunities, which it's now denied because of that, the Durand Line.
You brought up this issue of Pashtuns, and you said it might be a controversial statement to say that they are the majority group. I remember you being at an event we organized last year in the EU Parliament on Afghanistan.
Yes.
And I also remember that you, whatever I can say as a non-Afghan, that you represented the case of Afghanistan in its entirety.
Yeah.
To the best of your ability and what was needed as a platform as such. But what we also saw that there are many divisions between Afghans as well, on terms of ethnicity. How do you respond to that? How do you feel about the fact that Afghanistan is under rule of Taliban? There are countries, big states playing their strategic games in Afghanistan, and then the Afghans at this moment, instead of uniting for one cause or to get rid of these people, they have these very, big, but these divisions within themselves. How do you respond to that, not as a Pashtun, but as an Afghan?
As an Afghan who is made of different ethnic groups, I think that it's obviously very, very sad to see Afghans infighting, but I don't think that it's surprising. The reason why I say it's not surprising is because if you look at the 1990s, the civil war that occurred in Afghanistan, it's one of the most horrific wars. Other people have different views, and they'll say that that's not the most horrific war, and that there have been other horrific wars in Afghanistan. But I think that in its most recent modern history, that's probably the most horrific war in terms of the different ethnic groups fighting one another. And that type of hatred coming out in really physical violence and dehumanizing manner that it came out in, those wounds were not healed, because then you immediately had the Taliban takeover, and then you had an interim government and then a democratic republic. But those wounds were never healed. That discussion was never had over what actually occurred in the 90s, who was actually traumatized in that fighting and the difficulties that people went through. Kabul was basically split between ethnic neighborhoods, and people couldn't travel between the different neighborhoods because they were of a certain ethnic group. So I think those discussions weren't actually had, and the wounds weren't actually healed. And then immediately you went into a democratic setup that many Afghans say was forced upon them in a way that they hadn't wanted, because initially Afghans in the Bonn conference had wanted the monarch to return. The monarch was rejected by the United States, and then the Afghans chose another leader who was not Hamid Karzai, and that was rejected, and so Hamid Karzai was chosen as the interim leader of the country, and then won the elections in 2004-03 it was. So I think that that's not surprising in terms of the historical context. In terms of the 2021 Taliban takeover and return, because the majority of people who make up the Taliban are from the Pashtun ethnic group, many people blame Pashtuns for what occurred. Because
the Pashtuns are also most of the victims.
Yeah, so I think that what people fail to understand or realize is that actually Pashtuns have been at the forefront of a lot of violence in Afghanistan over the last 20 years during the Islamic Republic, and we have to accept this as a fact, that there was the divides between the Afghan government in terms of how the different ministries was recruited and set up in terms of ethnicity versus who were they actually fighting in the villages and the provinces in Afghanistan. From the outside, if you looked in, it looked like the Pashtuns were being killed and slaughtered in the south and the provinces, and it was the Afghan National Army that was made up of mostly other ethnic groups. But realistically, that obviously was not the case. There were obviously Pashtuns within the Afghan National Defense Security Forces, and the Archik tribe, for example, in Kandahar, who were on the forefront of fighting against the Taliban in the south. So I think there's a not an understanding of the suffering that's occurred within Pashtun communities, which is why a lot of people blame Pashtuns, because the Taliban is made up of them. But it's difficult because what is preconceived from the outside and how it looks is not always how it is on the ground. I think that one of the ways that we can get past this is to build a consensus and understanding that it wasn't just one community that suffered, it was all communities that struggled and suffered in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, that there were neighborhoods in Kabul that were obviously targeted because of ethnicity, but the same thing also occurred in the south and in other areas. And so having an understanding of that and saying that it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both, and both can be the same. It doesn't need to be a competition. We'll try and get Afghans to come around to the idea. But I do think naturally, the majority ethnic group is not naturally going to be blamed because people preconceive their power, preconceive that they're most powerful. But as is in any society, you can have a lot of people, but they're from different socio-economic classes. You have poor Pashtuns with no power, and at the same time you have rich Pashtuns with lots of power, and you have the same in other ethnic groups, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Hazaras. And so I think people need to come to that kind of understanding. I get a lot of abuse online. I get a lot of abuse when I go to panels, but I am not fazed by it that much, because I know that my understanding is from my experience, my professional work, and the work that I do within the humanitarian sector. And many of the criticisms that come are from people who either don't have that experience, don't have that understanding, and have never actually been to Afghanistan or the region. And so I can contextualize it in that. But also, I want to, understand that they're coming from a place of pain and trauma. So if you have not really dealt with that yourself, you obviously lash out and will express it in a different way. But I think that this is where the West can come in and actually listen to the voices working, because it's easier to work for division than it is for unity. It's much more difficult to try and bring people together. It's very easy to split people apart. And I think that Afghans need to focus on bringing people together, because whether you like it or not, the country is the form that it is right now, has the name that it has right now, and you need to work together to try and get it to a place where everyone is happy and living in a democratic, free country, which cannot happen if the Taliban are in control of it, and the Taliban will stay in control if Afghans continue fighting amongst themselves. So,
and if you go by the perception that majority of the Taliban fighters are Pashtun, in contrast, you also have another movement, which is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is non-violent. So, what do you like? I know the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement is mostly an issue which deals within, it's for rights within Pakistan under the constitution of Pakistan, but it is mainly Pashtuns. Where do you stand on their ideology, on their demands?
So I am a supporter of PTM, and I I can say this, I'm friends with Mansour Pashtun, and he's a good friend of mine, and I respect him hugely. He is a very brave and courageous individual for doing what he's doing in the face of violence and threats in Pakistan. I think it's not easy what he's doing, and I think that it would be unfathomable, to think that he's doing something like this. I think if you look at Pakistan in 2012 or 2011, what Mansour has achieved now is crazy, and people think would have been impossible during that time. To get people out on the streets chanting for their rights, their constitutional rights, which they have a complete right to under not only national but international law. It's a huge thing, and I admire and respect him. But I think that in terms of what PTM is trying to achieve is, as I said, the removal of the Pashtuns towards this factory line of the madrasas and being institutionalized by extremist ideology to then be used for political purposes by the ISI, by the Haqqani network, by other groups within the Taliban. And I think that's the key to breaking down this entire regional war and trying to stop what's going on in both countries. So I think that's what PTM is trying to achieve by trying to reduce poverty. Fighting for constitutional rights means reducing poverty, means reducing the factory line towards the madrasas, and therefore reducing the factory line to the extremists. And therefore towards peace within their villages, and the demilitarization of Waziristan, and stopping having Taliban camps, training camps within those places, or the Taliban's influence within Waziristan specifically, the opening of schools, having hospitals, just basic things that they should have, which they don't. Would actually help the situation in both places, I think.
So just like 100 years ago, when the ideologies of Gandhi and Basha Khan, of non-violent movements were important, they are as important as they were then.
Yeah, I think that this is hugely. I hope that he is successful in what he does. I think it's hugely brave, because I've seen protesters walk towards live round of bullets from the Pakistani army. That's not easy to do. No, like it's not easy to do that. And for them to have done that and to give the sacrifices and the martyrs that they've given, I think it's all in the cause of a peaceful Afghanistan. And a peaceful Waziristan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, because those are the regions that are most impacted.
Peymana, we're coming to the end of this interview because before we started, you already told me that an hour is too long, and I think we're already busy an hour. But there's so much to discuss, so I'm going to go to the last few questions I have.
Okay.
One is, and that's particularly from my own experience, is that again, going to the Soviet war in Afghanistan, you had a lot of radicals, mujahideen, jihadis coming into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Once the Soviets left, you had this civil war which erupted, and then you had the Taliban, which took majority of the country. They took, but you were left with a lot of battle-hardened terrorists, which eventually, at that time, we experienced it in Kashmir. That many of them came to Kashmir. We used to call them guests. To fight, there. And now, of course, you have Taliban in Afghanistan. According to many observers, it's impossible for the Taliban to keep ruling this country. At some point of time, many observers say that they will fall. What will happen to all these battle-hardened terrorists? Where will they go? As you said, they won't go to Xinjiang, so where do you see them going? What will happen? Will it ever become stable? Not only Afghanistan, but this region, India, Pakistan, will it ever become stable?
So I am a person who supports a diplomatic solution to this, a sit-down political negotiation solution to whatever is currently going on, especially in Afghanistan. Most Afghans have still not come around to that idea. Because they see resistance in terms of armed resistance as the only way. But my question is, who is the armed resistance, and that armed resistance being a national unified force rather than a specific interest group for a certain individual or person. But I think in the future, yes, we will see the Taliban fall because they cannot govern a country where 50% of its population are not allowed to work, not allowed to go to school, not allowed to go to the park freely, can't even take a taxi on their own, and you have a huge amount of that population who are widows, who don't have male members of their family to help provide
orphans.
Food. Yeah, orphans. And there's a huge amount of poverty and difficulty. You've got sanctions on the country, you've got UN recognized terrorists within its cabinet. These are huge difficulties that the Taliban has in governing Afghanistan. They went from an insurgent force attacking to now trying to govern. And I recently heard, I think it was Mullah Brother, who said that it's not the Taliban's responsibility to feed you. God is responsible for that, so stop complaining. They're going to struggle because people are not going to put up with this kind of governance for long. So either the people will resist and join forces with resistance groups, or the international community will have to come to some kind of diplomatic endgame on it and a political sit-down. But I don't think that in terms of what we're currently seeing in the region, in terms of Pakistan's role with the Taliban and the status quo, I don't see either option at the moment becoming some sort of fruitful end, because I don't see any armed resistance group really providing that resistance on a ground where the Taliban actually, or the international community, take it seriously. And on the other end, the Taliban refuse to sit down at the political table and have negotiations. But one thing that I will say is that Afghans are not, the Afghans intermarry, right? Afghans are mixed. As much as we try and divide them into different ethnic groups, we are incredibly mixed as a society and group of people. And so I think that what we look at in the future is a sort of, once Afghans have got over the trauma of what's happened, and it's been 2 years now, But once the Afghans come to an agreement on how to negotiate with the Taliban or how to respond to the Taliban, then you will see a fierce movement towards some sort of future endgame. Because in the past we've had the Rome group, which was the group that was trying to reinstall the former king of Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. And we also had all these other resistance groups who were fighting within Afghanistan against the Taliban. So you had Ahmad Shah Massoud in Panjshir, who was actually in the country fighting the Taliban and had an entire province under his control in resistance. So there were different ways to try and leverage some sort of conversation, negotiation with the Taliban. Now, currently, there is no group that all Afghans can rally around, or there's no sort of controlled province or armed resistance groups within the country that can actually push the Taliban to come to terms with some sort of an agreement. So I think in the future, what we will see is that these jihadi groups either link up to more internationally active jihadi networks and launch some type of attack on the West. That will trigger a response from the West to Afghanistan, or we see the West actually becoming serious and engaging. But I think what we've kind of missed in this conversation is the role of the Arab countries, the Arab majority countries, Saudi, the UAE, Qatar, for example, in pressurizing the Taliban to move on a more diplomatic way forward so that we can avoid war and destruction, really.
Because many of the things that the Taliban, tries to implement in Afghanistan is basically the Wahhabi thought of Saudi Arabia, while Saudi Arabia seems to have moved on.
Yes. Saudi Arabia is wanting to be the new Europe.
Right? Or the new Dubai.
The new Dubai or the new Europe, that they've said that in 5 years' time, Saudi or...
They have cinemas and fashion shows.
Yes, I mean, exactly. So I think that the Taliban need to... Well, one of the hopes that I have, if we're talking about actually on the foot ground soldiers, is that I read a report recently where a Taliban soldier entered Kabul for the first time and was shocked. Was shocked at the buildings, was shocked at the development, did not even think that Kabul was like this. And there's that iconic photo of a Taliban fighter with a gun in a bookshop, and everyone's like, stop romanticizing the Taliban. But actually that kind of stuff gives me hope, because when you have awareness and you have education, you also have the opening of the mind. So you have these Taliban fighters who cannot read and write, but they're coming in and they're actually saying, oh, okay, so there's a woman in a hijab and she's walking normally in the street and she's just doing a normal job, or she just wants to provide her for her family. And okay, there's a building, and there's Muslims here, and there's and there's Azan in the mosque, and they've been taught and told these things that are not true, and so it's like breaking down the
it's so funny because you remind me of this when fighters, jihadis from Afghanistan used to come to Kashmir. They were actually told before they came there that Muslims were not allowed to pray, that there was no azan in the mosque, that women were being kidnapped, sold, and then they came there and then they saw that none of that was true. And many of them then quickly returned and said, well, this is not my battle to fight.
Exactly. I think that's what I hope will come from this. That's what I hope the last 2 years has been for a lot of the foot soldiers, which is why many of them, there are reports that they're getting bored. They don't know what to do with themselves, or there are reports that certain fighters actually said, well, what was this for? Because I was told that there wasn't Muslims in Kabul, and there are Muslims. And so I hope that kind of awareness and education spreads, so we have more of an understanding on sort of the ground, rather than the leadership of the Taliban, but the actual ground foot soldiers. I think that's where the change will come, because...
and where will that change be coming from? Will that be indeed, as you described, Kabul? Will it be Washington? Will it be Brussels? Or will it be Rawalpindi?
I don't think that we can create that change from a regional country, outside influence. I think that will come naturally through access to information, social media, and interaction with society in general. But that can't happen if Afghanistan isn't allowed to flourish, and the Taliban leadership continue to provide policies where they're dehumanizing and removing the rights of 50% of the population of Afghanistan, which is women and girls, and imprisoning and killing their political rivals. I think that what we'll see in the future is either an attack from one of these groups in the West, where the West will re-engage, or we will see a natural grassroots movement within Afghanistan that will be supported by Afghans from outside, that will challenge the Taliban, either an armed resistance group that might gain some kind of control, or more diplomatic initiatives between people to people conversations.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the last question.
Okay.
And I want to, you've talked about so many things, and I actually have a lot of other things lined up to ask you, but let's leave it at that. But the last question I want to ask you is to give a message to a few people, and I'm going to ask you what message do you give to your, Afghan girls and women? You being an Afghan woman who has been elected to public office in the UK, what message do you give to them?
In Afghanistan, I would say that you're not forgotten, and that there are people who are still fighting for your rights and trying to raise awareness of what's going on in the country. But I would say mainly don't lose hope, because things change, quickly. They can turn around very, very fast. And I think that there are people in Afghanistan at the moment who are doing a lot of good in terms of not only trying to deliver humanitarian aid, but also jobs and trying to support women and girls there currently. It might not be at the level that it was before the Taliban, but I think that that's where I would say for them not to lose hope, because there are good people doing some good stuff to try and change the situation. And yes, I would say don't lose hope, and don't forget that there are people out here who still remember and try and help, and to try and basically do something to keep yourself happy, because I have lots of friends and networks in Afghanistan at the moment who have told me that they feel hopeless and they feel like that there's no way out. And it's interesting because I just came here from Israel, Palestine, and I'm speaking to young Palestinians there who are living in occupied Palestinian territories, and they feel hopeless and they feel really difficult. So I guess my message to Afghans in Afghanistan would be: you're not alone. You're not the only people in the world who feel alone or feel like they're going through difficulties, and that there are others like you, but they're also good people trying to help. So not to forget that, basically.
And what will you, in your role as a councillor in the UK, as much as you can, you will continue to highlight this issue, especially of the girls and the women over there?
I mean, I still try and use my platform as much as I can to discuss Afghanistan, to remind politicians about Afghanistan, and to highlight what's going on, to try and bring people together to find solutions on how we go forward. But in my own capacity as a councillor in Harrow, I've been helping many, many families who actually were evacuated from Afghanistan, who now have settled in the UK. So that's part of my work as a local councillor and as a representative in the UK. So it's on all fronts, really. We try and do the international stuff and also the domestic stuff. But I'm only one person and I can't do this alone, so we need to do it together. And so, which is why I think Afghans need to stop infighting and fighting each other, because I'm not the Taliban, so people should stop attacking me or other people who are trying to do good, and actually work and join forces with them to try and defeat what we see as an extremist group who are in control of the country now, who are implementing policies that are harmful to all of its citizens, and that no Afghan really wants, because no Afghan has chosen it. So, yeah.
What would you say to the Pakistani Military Establishment?
The world has moved on from these internal conflicts, and that I think it's time that they saw what's happening in their own country, to their own people, and that the extremist influence that the Taliban is having on their society, and that it's not going to have a fruitful end for them. So I think that they should reverse what they're doing and stop what they're doing, because not only is it against human rights, but isn't the right thing to do, and it's not actually helping their country in any shape or form. So,
Peymana, thank you very much, and let's hope you've always been introduced as the first Afghan origin elected to public office elected in the UK. Let's hope one day we can say you're the first Afghan origin Prime Minister of UK. Why not?
Thank you so much. I don't know if that will ever come true, but we'll see.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.